Stirling, thanks so much for joining us. I'd just like to begin by asking you your thoughts on the 2012 season so far, as early as it is. We've had a little bit of pre-season test.
Yeah, it doesn't mean much, so let's face it, you never know what loads they've got, what they're testing, what they're trying out, and so I don't think it indicates much. We can go by history of what happened before. I think the Ferrari is particularly ugly, which I think is a shame, because I can't really remember any ugly car winning a race.
Well, it's a good point, really. I mean, did you ever drive what you considered to be an ugly car?
I don't remember one, actually. Probably the two-seater HWM was the ugliest. But I mean, things like 250Fs and Alphas, always a good-looking car, and before the war as well.
Michael Schumacher, still very much a part of Formula One. We've spoken about this before, but I wonder what, right now, your opinion is about Michael's return and his chances going into 2012.
I think the greatest thing Michael did really was get Ferrari back into the top of racing. I think the sport, I think he's a benefit, because it gives other people somebody to shoot at who's 7 times world champion, which really doesn't mean much, but it's something to talk about. So good, and I think he'll do a good job. I don't think he'll be his co-driver, but I'm glad he's in there.
When you look at him now, and you look at other drivers who have made comebacks, Niki Lauda is another, out of retirement, do you ever think to yourself, 1962, maybe I could have been racing 62, 63, 64?
I think I did. I think I prematurely retired. Whether it would have worked or not in another year, the trouble was it took 3 years for my concentration to come back, and it's a very important ingredient of going quickly. So I'm sorry I didn't wait a bit longer, let's put it that way, and then I'd have known more definitely what the situation was.
So Stirling, you look incredibly well, and I can't even now begin to think about that shunt you had last year in the lift, which you said, I think, was probably worse than the shunt you had at Spa in 1960 when a Lotus rear wheel came off the car.
I mean, I went down from the 3rd floor to an American, 2nd floor to us, and that's quite a long way.
Well, it's a massively long way. How do you feel now? Are there any side effects at all?
Yes, stiff when I get up, those usual things, but then I'm getting on as well. So I don't know which is which, whether it's my age or the bashing I've taken. But no, I mean, it's something that shouldn't have happened, because it was purely a malfunction, not of the lift, but of the electrics. So it's pretty upsetting, really. Let's
just talk about shunts in general, because you lived in an incredibly dangerous era. But you had a lot of shunts, but you survived, and you often joke about Colin Chapman and his approach to motor racing, and you first met him in the Vanwall days, of course.
I think Colin Chapman was a man of great intelligence. No doubt he could build a fantastic car. The design was great. Trouble was, I think he skimped too much in certain places, and he didn't really. Driver, I don't think, mattered any more to him than it did Enzo Ferrari. I mean, the driver's there just to demonstrate his car. There's no doubt it was a great car. Not a nice car to drive in the way a Cooper was, but it's certainly more competitive, if you like.
And speaking of Ferrari, again, I'd love to hear in your own words the business of almost driving for Ferrari back in the early 50s and going, I think, all the way to Bari and finding Taruffi in your seat. And then subsequently you were talking to them quite closely in 61, I believe.
I was speaking to him because he called me up and said, would I go and see him? And I went down there, and we kissed and made up and everything else. And he said to me, he said, look, if you tell me what car you want, a 246 or a 248 or whatever, I'll build it for you. I said, well, what I want is a 246 Formula One car, and also the sports car. I want one painted in Rob Walker blue with a white band, and the other one in BRP green, and I'll drive for you. And he said, okay, I'll do it, which was all I asked. And so everything worked out the way. If only that the Ferrari had arrived before my crash at Goodwood, I'm sure I would still be racing. Well, I'm a bit old now. Carried on for quite a while.
I think you'd still be competitive. The Goodwood shunt, any final conclusion in your mind as to the cause of that, Easter Monday, 62?
No, I've analysed it and thought about it. I think all I can say is I think that it was the fact that Graham Hill had a very wide line, and I was actually coming up to unlap myself, so I was no threat to him. And he's coming into this corner, and then he pulled across, and of course, as he pulled across, I went left, and I think probably the flag marshals waved to him, and he may have waved back. I may have mistaken that wave for, okay, you can come through. And I tried, and of course it was on the wet grass, it was no good at all. But whatever it was, it unfortunately meant that I had to start working for a living at the age of 32. It was pretty awful.
Well, we'll get onto that in a little bit, because you've been brilliantly successful in your post-racing years. But when you say Graham was on the wide line, it does open up an interesting line of thought, which is, I remember chatting to you at least 20, 30 years ago now, about the critical area of skill in approaching a corner and doing the corner well. And you always said it was braking. And although I was never lucky enough to see you drive, I suspect that in general, your line and your braking was pretty much inside that of somebody like Graham Hill, extending the straights, in other words.
Yes. I mean, the thing is, Graham had always took a wide line, a very big. I didn't. I would take the narrow line, in other words, close in or closer in, so that I could brake later. Because one place you can pass a Formula One car is under braking. You can't out-accelerate them unless they're not competitive, and you can't really out-corner them unless the driver's pretty incompetent. So really, braking was very important, and therefore, at this point, though, of course, I wasn't braking. I mean, it's not a corner I would brake for.
And we see that today. We see different styles on the track today. Rubens Barrichello is a driver I would suggest got a Graham Hill wide approach, and we have other drivers with a much closer line of the one you've described. But of course, it's more than just saying I'm going tight, I'm going wide. It's about footwork. It's about coming off the brakes at the right rate, and that for you, as I understood it, was the critical part of driving a racing car well.
Well, I think the most important thing really was to get the car set up the way you wanted it, so it behaved in the fashion. In other words, I like to have a bit of oversteer because it's more difficult to deal with. But if you can accept that and you drive accordingly, then I think it's probably a little bit faster than understeering car. Because once you're understeering, there's nothing you can do to get it back in.
So Stirling, let's talk a little bit about your post-racing life, because just even chatting to you now and the responses you're giving and the way we're talking just shows how agile your brain still is. And for many years, or several years, you were an entrant. Stirling Moss Automobile Racing Team, Smart, great name. Yeah. Peter Sellers, all sorts of wonderful people that you were associated with at that time. Let's look back at that. What were your ambitions at that point, and why were you doing a racing team?
I think to stay in with the people that I knew and liked so much. I mean, being in racing is a very important thing to me. I'm not now because obviously I don't know many of the drivers, but I think it's a very nice place to be, and you get their confidence and a lot of things to talk about and compare notes and so on. And it's just an enjoyable way of being.